Around the world, countries like USA and China, they're modernizing their grid in anticipation of electrifying their economies. And the estimates are that advanced economies like Canada will take 2 to 3 times as much electricity by 2050. And for developing economies, it'll be 3 to 5 times as much as they currently produce. Well, that raises the whole issue of grid modernization and integration. It sounds like a geeky term, but it's really, really critical to the energy transition in Canada's economy. So I'm going to talk to Philip Duguay, who is the managing director of Canada Grid, which is a recently formed group that's going to be advocating for the integration of the grid east and west in Canada, and also with the American grid. So welcome to the interview, Philip.
Thanks for having me, Markham.
Well, why don't you give us an overview of Canada Grid's objectives?
Great. So right now we're in the midst of building a coalition, and the coalition is going to be comprised of industry. So that could be developers, technology manufacturers, different engineering service companies, labor. So it's very important to have big labor on our side, and also civil society groups. And what unites these groups is a common vision for grid integration. So really, that's what you were just speaking about, making sure that we conduct interregional planning between the provinces and the American states, so that when we're making long-term decisions about decarbonization, we're actually having a very sophisticated planning approach that allows us to source the most affordable, smart, clean energy electrons that we can get. And we need an abundant supply of clean energy electrons to drive our industries, to power our cities, to heat our homes, to get our cars to move in the morning. And we need to be able to trade power across vast distances. So we're just beginning to have this conversation and build this coalition. And so this is why we're coming out and speaking in the media, is to attract attention to it.
And I should mention for our viewers who may not be totally familiar with the context, in the United States, there is a federal regulator that has some authority over electricity. That isn't the case in Canada. The federal government has almost no involvement in the electricity system. It's set up under the Constitution. Energy is the purview of the provinces. Each one has their own, mostly a government-owned utility, and it only trades within the province. And if there is trade, it's usually north-south. So BC trades with Washington and California, Manitoba trades with Minnesota, Quebec trades with New York and the New England states, that sort of thing. That's a problem, breaking down those barriers. Have I got that right, Philip?
Yeah, yes, to a large degree. And this is why Canada Grid is actually being formed right now. It's in response to, and proactively, in response to the overhaul of FERC regulations. So the very, very powerful FERC makes regulations in the United States that impact Canadians all the time. And so what we're saying is, hey, if FERC is going to overhaul the interregional planning process, Canadians should have a role in that, and we should be communicating with our American state neighbors as they push for market integration amongst American states. We need to have the provinces at the table saying, hey, we have interest too. And so, you know, there's this common joke that, yeah, Canada doesn't have a FERC, but FERC is our FERC. And so you'd be surprised. A lot of Americans that I've reached out to in the last several weeks, they want to hear from Canadian counterparts. And what we lack is that kind of grid diplomacy team from Canada that can actually do that. So what Canada Grid is hoping to do is very simple. We want to develop a tool set for the provincial authorities and their American commissioner counterparts, the state commissioners, so they can come together and sit at a common table and actually have the informed dialogue that they need to have. That dialogue needs to be neutrally facilitated, needs to be full of expertise that I simply don't have, but we all know that conversation needs to happen. So that's what Canada Grid is going to advocate for. Yeah.
Yeah, and I think that's really important because What you see in the United States, of course, is that as the renewables, wind and solar, and now batteries penetrates more and more into electricity systems, is one way to deal with the intermittency is to have bigger markets. You trade with more of your neighbors, and that gives you access to supply when you need it, and they have access to your supply if you have surplus. And that kind of brings greater resilience to grids, and especially in the face of extreme weather caused by or exacerbated by climate change. I would imagine the Americans will be quite keen to sit down with Canadians.
Yes, I agree 100%. And of course, the Department of Energy just signed a memorandum of understanding with the Canadian Ministry of Natural Resources just a couple of weeks ago. This was announced. And it's really important that we actually put some meat on the bones. We can't just have that be a hollow document. It needs to be substantive, and we need to, again, build these channels through which we can have this dialogue. But at the end of the day, it's really about our national and continental competitiveness in this global decarbonized economy. So we need to be able to move those electrons for grid reliability, but also to drive our industries. So for instance, if we look at this zone here, the NPCC zone in the east, the continental northeast, that's Ontario to basically Newfoundland and Labrador, and then New York and New England. That's 60 million people in that zone. That's a $4 trillion GDP. If we want to attract manufacturing from North Carolina up to New York State or to Ontario, or if we want to attract manufacturing from China and reshore back to North America, we need to be able to move those electrons as they are needed in bulk.
Yeah, I make this argument all the time, is that essentially we're heading to an electric economy. The future is electric is a pretty good slogan these days, and pretty accurate. And that makes the generation of electricity, the transmission of electricity, the distribution of electricity absolutely critical to economic competitiveness. And at this point, Canada has a lot of work to do on, not so much on its north-south trade, but in its east-west trade. I mean, we just, one of the examples that I've interviewed about is, BC Hydro has their hydro dams can act as almost like batteries for renewables that are electricity generated from wind and solar in southern Alberta. But we don't do that. We don't have a big enough intertie. There's a lot of work to be done here, and this issue needs to be put on the table with Canadian policymakers and the Canadian public.
Market integration is only going to strengthen the bonds between Canadians and give us more influence and kind of purchasing power down in the United States. So BC and Alberta, Manitoba and Saskatchewan, these provinces united together can exert a lot of market influence to their south and also benefit from those resources. So on a very cold day in February, when there's a surplus of solar electrons in California, which is a problem they have almost every day, they cannot move those electrons where they're to anywhere useful. We can import those and keep the water behind the dams in British Columbia, for instance, and then wheel that power later in the day when Alberta needs it. So really, it is about trade. It's about load management and being able to depend on one another. At the end of the day, this heat dome, the pandemic, all the troubles we see in the world, we're dependent on each other, and we need to have market structures that enable that. So our hope is that we can stop squabbling about kind of the Section 91, 92 powers and the tug of war between Ottawa and the provinces, and start focusing on, okay, here's the question. What mechanisms are going to guide us towards our outcomes that we want for 2050? We need a rational framework for investment and need to evade major missed opportunities with large projects that haven't gone well. And frankly, we've had a lot of those in Canada lately.
Well, Philip, thank you very much for this. Really appreciate your insights, and we'll be following your activities with considerable interest. Thank you.
Thank you so much.